I can forget to plug it in, and it still drive it again round trip the next day. If I hit a third day, I can at least make it to the Derby supercharger and then and plug that in. But
use a Tesla charger in your garage or anything?
yeah, you got a
These things are awesome.
40 amp system.
Yeah, 48 amps.
48 amps, 60 amp breaker, 48 amp.
Okay. Welcome. Welcome back to those of you who have been attending our Tech Talks regularly, and welcome to those of you who are here with us for the first time. My name is Tracy Hoover, and I'm the co-founder of Groover Labs along with my husband, Kurt Ridley. Welcome to the fourth and final installment in 2020 of our Tech Focus speaker series. Before we get started, I just want to ask everybody to keep their masks on. I'm looking at you. Thank you. Given the COVID situation, it seems the smart thing to do. Anyway, Kurt and I would like to thank everybody who has joined us this year for our talks in person and at home. And I want to give a special thank you to our members and supporters who joined us at the beginning of this journey, this Groover Labs journey. Kurt and I are starting to get a glimpse of what we were hoping for Groover Labs, and it's due in part to the community that we've started to build here. Your Shakespeare reference for the day is to look up the St. Crispin's Day speech from Henry V, because we're a happy band of brothers and sisters here. Oh, can you turn that on? Thank you. So that's your homework assignment for tonight. As many of you will realize, 2020 hasn't been the year we expected, and so we've had to rethink many aspects of what we do here at Groover Labs, which is to foster growth in our local startup activity by providing a single location where entrepreneurs and tech workers can support and share ideas in a collaborative environment. That's where the idea for these tech talks came from, and we wanted to find a way to keep our community together while, things are just so weird. So I want to thank Ramsey Jamul of the Unified Esports Association. He was our first speaker. Jennifer Akers of AccuWeather, our second, and Clint Brower and Stephen Gentner from Greenfield Robotics last month for sharing their stories and helping us keep the conversation going. And a big thank you to Dave Cunningham, who's a member here and on the Groover Labs board, who has been driving the effort to start these and keep these going. It's been a team effort, but Dave's really been driving it. And while this is the last talk for the year, keep an eye out next year for some exciting announcements. We've been working on some new initiatives to further support and grow the startup community. But we're ending the year on a bit lighter note. We've convened a panel of hybrid and electric car owners to hear them talk about what they've learned about their vehicles and where they see the industry going. We're happy to welcome back Jason Taves, co-founder and chief technical officer of Quick. Jason is also a Tesla owner, so don't be surprised if he sounds as much like a panelist as he does a moderator. And thank you to our panelists as well.
Thank you so much, Tracy. It's always fun to be a part of these events and to have everyone here in person, but also you who are at home. Thank you for tuning in and watching this, whether it's live or after the fact. Wanted to take some time to share the big thanks that we have up here for all of the sponsors that are involved. So we have Emprise Bank, and they, I believe, are the series sponsor for all of this. We also have Idea Tech, who sponsored this event specifically. And then we also have KMUW, who's our media sponsor. And we couldn't make this happen without sponsors and the community around Groover Labs. So again, thank you, Kurt and Tracy, for having this space, making this something that we can all come and do, even with a pandemic happening. So appreciate that. One of the things that I've noticed as you get electric car owners together, they just start talking like fanatics about the transition into a new and somewhat very different technology. And so I kind of would like to introduce each of the individuals here. First of all, to my right, we have Kurt Ridley, who is the CEO, right? Are you the CEO of?
We can go with that. Executive Director.
Executive Director of Groover Labs, Chief Floor Sweeper, right? And so he and Tracy are part of this philanthropy adventure that you guys are on. You guys started out on the East Coast and had a network a network business, right? Building switches and networking here, right?
Yeah, networking hardware startup back a few years ago, back when the internet was really starting out and booming, and turned out well. And out of that, we set up a nonprofit philanthropic organization, and that's basically what ended up creating this. So.
Excellent. Very cool. And then to Kurt's right, we have Randy Robot.
Hello?
And Randy, can you share a little bit about where you started? I believe it was at McCall, correct?
Yeah, I came here in 1990 as an F-16 instructor pilot at McConnell Air Force Base. It's back when I was about 6'2" and pulled 9 Gs for 10 years. Then you get compressed down to what we have today. But no, I flew F-16s at the base, and then B-1 bombers, and then became the intelligence wing commander for the Air National Guard, and then retired in 2009 and went to work for WSU Tech as their IT director. And I took delivery of my Tesla Model Y in June after dreaming of it for the last 2 years. So it's everything I hoped it would be and more.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your service, Randy. Really
Thank
appreciate that. And then over here on the right, Paul Maceberg. I knew I was going to mess that up. But Paul, you're a software engineer at AccuWeather, right?
Right, yep. I've came to Wichita 13 years ago, and I've worked at AccuWeather ever since. And a few years ago, I was looking for a new car, and I ended up getting a Chevy Volt. I actually bought it used because at the time it was pretty much equivalent in price to other used cars. So I thought I would just experiment and see what it was like.
Excellent. So I'm very curious, what brought you to Wichita?
My wife actually had a job here, and we were married straight in college. And so I came along and got lucky and found a job within the first 2 weeks of being here. So,
And you're glad to be here?
yeah.
Perfect.
I also volunteer at River Labs a bit.
I heard you pulled at least 6 miles of cable through this building.
Oh, I'm sure the number keeps rising, so it should be up to 10 by now.
Because you were working on all of the door access controls, right?
Still working.
Still,
on it.
okay. When did River Labs open, Kurt?
We're still kind of opening. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you, all three of you, for being here. And Kurt, I believe you own Priuses, right?
Yeah, I have a 2006 Prius, and Tracy, my wife, has a 2008. So we're a Prius family.
There you go. Excellent. Well, I'd love to start tonight because we do want to talk about a lot of different things, right? We've got full electric car owners here. We have hybrid electric car owners here. And, you know, we've got some general themes and ideas from the audience here in person that I think are really interesting to talk about. So I'd love to start on kind of the timeline of how did cars start to become electrified? And obviously the hybrids came first. So maybe talking to Kurt, some of your experience with being a Prius owner, you know, what are some of the reasons that you looked into buying a Prius? And what did that change about how you drove a car, if anything?
So I grew up in Kansas, went to school at WSU, but most of my career was around the Boston area. We moved back here in 2005, and I forget the exact year the Prius came out, but I think maybe it's early 2000s, 2002 or something. And I desperately wanted to get a Prius just because it was cool technology and made a lot of sense. But they were in very short supply in the Boston area. And I was very frustrated and almost had given up. And then we moved back here, and there were like 6 sitting on the lot at Eddie's Toyota. So it allowed me the chance to buy one. And you know what excited me, and I think still makes a lot of sense in some ways, the most sense for most, if it's a car that is like your only car. So you got to be able to go pretty much anywhere. You still have the electric, ideally a plug-in hybrid, which I think is the Volt is more of a plug-in hybrid. So you can, if it could go say 30 miles or so on a charge, you could do your commute to work and stuff and be all electric. But if you needed to go, you know, cross country to Wamego, Kansas or somewhere like that, you can get there and not have to worry about charging. And the Prius though, I think really only has like 3 or 4 mile range on it. If you went all battery, which I think there's a way you can do that, you can only go very short distances. So you really rely on the engine to recharge, but it does it very efficiently. The scariest thing is the first time you pull into a busy intersection, with hearing you can hear the engine running, and you pull in the busy intersection and it stops. And you're like, oh my God, the engine's died, but all you do is press on the gas pedal. It immediately starts up and you go. But it takes some getting used to, but been getting consistently over 40 miles a gallon, 40 to 45 miles a gallon in town and on the highway. And so I think it's really cool technology, and like I say, very flexible.
Right. So, and even a car that's, I mean, you said 2006?
Yeah.
Yeah, so 14 years old, still getting over 40.
Yeah, and maybe later we can talk about the battery pack. People, used to be really worried about that. I think when I bought it, a replacement battery pack, even though it's not all that big, was like $7,500. But on my car, I've actually have replaced the battery pack, and it wasn't anywhere near that expensive. So
good.
I think I have about 140,000 miles. I don't drive a huge amount, but generally been a very positive experience.
So there's a little bit of transition in terms of the car doing things that, while it stopped, it's shutting down, regenerative braking, I'm sure.
Yeah, you don't
Takes
notice
a little bit to get used to.
Most of that. Usually people, when they buy a car like this, they're kind of really into the technology. I've met many people with cars like this that say, I just get in and push the gas and it goes. And they give you a screen that, gives you feedback on what your mileage is. And your first 6 months, you're like, driving at 15 miles an hour on the highway because you're maximizing your mileage and all those kind of crazy, drafting behind semis. And then after a while, you're like, this is too stressful. I'm just going to drive the car. But the Prius is a nice size car, at least for us. We have a family of 4, and it's bigger than most people think. And so it's really just a regular car. And your brain just has to get used to that. Occasionally the motor quits, and usually at scary times, but it always starts up again. So
There you go. The beginning of range anxiety. The start way back with the Priuses. So Paul, tell me a little bit about with your Chevy Volt. I mean, it's more of a plug-in. You've got more range on it. So you do plug it in and you can put fuel in it. Talk to me about what that's like.
Yeah, so it's technically an extended range hybrid. And actually, my wife got a 2014 plug-in Prius before I got the Volt. And that is also an extended range hybrid. It has like a 10-mile range to it. The Priuses really weren't designed for get up and go. They're really about that economy and getting good gas mileage. And so if you try to accelerate with a Prius, it's generally, not ideal for it, right? And so the Volt has a larger battery in it. The first model came out with a 30-mile range on the battery. The later model that's up to 60 or more, I think. And then it still has a gasoline engine in it. And so for me personally, to commute to work when that used to be a thing, it was about a little under a 30-mile commute. And so I can drive to work and drive home, plug it in every night, and never have to run the gasoline engine. Occasionally it'll actually come up and be like, we need to run the engine for maintenance for 10 minutes, and it'll do that. But then because of, range anxiety, if I go out of town, you just run on gasoline in a hybrid type mode. And that, same experience Kurt has described with the Prius. My model, I got it used, like I said, and it's a 2012. The time, that I've had it, the range has stayed pretty much the same. And what it can do wintertime, it does decrease a bit. And you can tell how inefficient a gasoline engine is when you're freezing to death in the winter, because the heater doesn't put out nearly as much inefficient heat off of a gasoline engine. You're having to take that from your battery, and then your range tends to drop because of that.
Right.
So
have you seen a real impact in like your fuel cost, right? Having some electric fuel cost and some gasoline fuel cost. Do you feel the difference there, or is that fuel pretty much the same?
I think it's come down a little bit, but I haven't done any sort of scientific comparisons. I'm primarily gassing up 3 times a year versus, every couple of weeks as my older car. My wife gassed up a little more because her range just requires driving more with the gas, and our electric bill naturally went up a little bit. And so I'd say we save a little bit, but that's just because I want to feel good about it. I don't know how true that statement is.
I feel good. Well, hey, only fueling up 3 times a year for having a hybrid. That's still very good.
Right.
Does that have to charge off of a 220 outlet or a 110?
Yeah, so it comes, both the Prius plug-in and the Volt came with a 110 charger. You can get a bigger charger, but given how small the battery is, it generally, the Volt will charge overnight, 8 hours, and with the slower one, and that's better to not stress the electrical grid, so I've just never got into a bigger charger.
So you charge all on 110?
Yes.
Wow, there you go. Randy, how about charging your Tesla on 110? How long would that take?
It would take a while since it's a 75 kilowatt hour battery pack, just like your Model 3, but I've got a 240 volt in the garage, and it's no big deal. You pull it in, you plug it in, and then you get up in the morning and it's whatever you set it to be. One thing with pure battery electric, the manufacturers recommend, if you can, to stay between 20 and 80%, which is the healthiest way for lithium ion batteries. But if you need to go on a trip, then charge it up to 100%. Just don't charge it up the night before, charge it up or have it so that it hits about 100% shortly before you get into drive for that. But initially I thought I would have some range anxiety, but it's been no problem. The 300-mile range on the Tesla Model Y is really an around the town kind of range, because you're more efficient, probably in the Priuses too, when you're driving and you're regenning, when you come to a stoplight or a stop sign. But once you get out on the highway, I remember when I picked my car up in Kansas City, and I drove all the way back to Wichita, and I didn't have to stop or get a charge, but I was driving 80 miles an hour with a huge headwind. And I was like, wow, this, it's 300 miles of range, but it shows me only getting home with 13%. So that's when I figured out, oh, well, you need to pay attention to those kind of things. And the computer tells you what you're going to get there with, but you need to pay attention to that. But you charge it up. I usually charge it to 65% because I don't need all that capacity. And then around town, probably 40 miles during the day, maybe it gets down to 45%, and then you plug it in and charge it. One of the big misconceptions I get a lot of questions is you have to go to the supercharger every day. It's like, no, you only go to superchargers or DC fast chargers if you're traveling. If you live here, you don't need to do that. You charge up at home. It's just easier to do that. I have a 48 amp circuit, or actually 60 amp circuit, produces 48 amps for the car. So it'll charge at a rate of about 44 miles an hour. So 300 mile battery pack, you can figure out how many hours it's going to take to charge that up.
There you go. So there's a couple of things that I know that we would like to touch on, and then I'd like to involve some of the audience here and online as well. So if you're online and you have questions and you'd like us to answer them, please start typing away now. We'd love to get those queued up, and Parker can give us a note on what those look like. But one of the things I know has come up a lot, especially recently. I mean, the other day we were talking about the right to repair and the ability to repair vehicles that get more and more complicated beyond traditional automotive repair shops and what their abilities are, or just even what information is out there on repairing cars. So Kurt and Paul, I'd love to hear your thoughts in terms of having cars that are both battery and traditional combustion engine based. Have you repaired anything? Have you had any problems repairing things on your car?
On the Prius, we haven't really repaired anything ourselves. We haven't had that much trouble with, other than the one I mentioned. I'd replaced the battery pack at one point. I think it was probably around 110,000, 115,000 miles. When your battery pack goes bad, it's like being in a nuclear warning. All the lights on the dash come on or flashing, and it's kind of a scary thing when it happens. But the car will go into a limp mode where it drives on the gas engine at a slow speed, so you can get somewhere. Turned out the battery pack had gone bad, and I think now the list price on the battery pack is about $2,500, but we found out if you call Toyota and kind of whine a little, they don't like the word to get out that you have to replace the battery pack, so they'll subsidize the replacement of the battery pack. So I think it cost us under $1,500 to replace the battery pack. One thing I did contemplate and never did was there's kind of a DIY conversion to upgrade the standard Prius, the older standard Priuses to be plug-in hybrids. So a bigger battery pack and the charger and stuff so you can plug it in. And I contemplated doing that, and there's definitely an active groups online and stuff that do that, but I never actually got to that point myself. But mostly it's the same as any modern car where it's gotten a lot of computers and stuff going on, and you can access online information. It's still possible, but it's getting harder and harder to work on your own car.
Right, yeah, I grew up in overhauled engines from pickups and things back in the day, and so I have quite a bit of mechanical knowledge. But I'll be honest, when I got the Chevy Volt, I went ahead and got an extended warranty, because when you look under the hood, it's just vastly different. At the same time, while I'm sure I could do the research, if you make a mistake with a battery, if you're talking those lead wires, there's an enormous amount of power there, and things can go bad pretty quickly. And, I'm sure with the right training, you could do that. I've just never been around that. So luckily the car's not had any issues. And if it did have issues, I think I'd be, taking it to the dealer just to make sure that there isn't.
Spilling gasoline on yourself and touching lead wires is a little bit different. Isn't it?
Yeah.
So one thing I'll mention on, because I was concerned about, if your battery dies or whatever, can you jump start something like a Prius? At least on the Prius, it turns out there's a small 12-volt battery that actually starts the gas engine. And if you need to jump start, you're basically, jump starting that battery. And so things like that you think, well, what if I have this massive battery pack and I short that out? It's, going to be exciting, but they've sort of isolated that in the trunk, and you have a smaller battery so you can jump start it. So in many ways, even though it kind of had to jury rig it, it's the same as a normal car.
Yeah. And I'll admit, like, having a Tesla for a little over a year now, like, that was definitely my biggest angst and also frustration, was that there was not this open market of being able to repair a Tesla. And I understand why, because as soon as you start talking autonomous cars and self-driving, and, this thing can, change because of a software update or the hardware that's connected to the car. I mean, it's a very complex system, especially when you're running that level of software with it. So the idea to let anybody just go in and start tweaking or tinkering with things has a lot of downstream ramifications. But I did hear in Massachusetts, they just passed the
Right to repair.
Right to Repair Act, so that the manufacturers have to provide the same diagnostic tools and repair tools that they have to independent repair shops, which Tesla has always gotten around because they said, well, we don't have any dealers. So it used to be that whatever you give the dealers, you have to make available. And since they didn't have any dealers, they didn't have to make it available. But now they're going to be under that from 2022, I think, 2022 models and forward. They'll have to do that. So they've got a little bit of time, but I mean, that is one of the most interesting things. Like, there's open APIs out there that you can get the data from your car, but you can't go in and like fiddle with its Linux operating system, or, there's simple parts that you can change, obviously, but.
Yeah, I think in the Tesla, you may have heard this too, there's only like 200 moving parts.
Yeah, there's not
So
much.
there's very little to go wrong. The battery packs last 300,000 to 500,000 miles. We were talking before we started here, there's a taxi group out of LA that drives every day from LA to Palm Springs and back. And they put 600,000 miles on a Model X and the same battery pack. So in the Tesla, it's also thermally managed. So there's a coolant system that goes through there, and it keeps it warm or hot or cold, depending on what's needed. So it really is fairly reliable. The warranty is 8 years or 120,000 miles on the battery pack. And then, so it's fairly reliable in that. One of the weird things is, because you mentioned that there's no dealers in Kansas, because the Kansas law prohibits direct sales of cars. So I had to take delivery of my car in Kansas City, Missouri, where there is a dealer, and then drive it here and get it registered locally for that. But they do provide a mobile ranger service. I don't know if you've used them.
Yep, several times.
So they come down to Wichita a couple days a week. They come to your work or your house, and whatever is needed, they'll fix it on the spot if you need it.
Yeah. Now, and the Ranger service has been great. I mean,
Oh,
they've installed, I think, the car that I got didn't come with a garage door opener module.
Yep.
So they came and installed that.
That's what I had to do too.
Yep.
It's
yep.
an after you purchase kind of thing, which is kind of weird. But
It's like, why don't, that feels like that would be included. Like, yeah, there's some interesting little things that you think would be included in Tesla's vehicles, but when you get into one of them, they are very minimalistic. And so there's a lot of components they just shoved into the software. I mean, like the dash, I don't know if anyone hasn't seen a dash of a Model 3, like there's nothing in front of your steering wheel. It's all on the big screen in the middle of the car. And so it's interesting.
And we get software updates every 2 to 3 weeks, and they're constantly improving and changing. That's probably the most dramatic thing is.
Yeah, I mean, that was the other component that I wanted to talk about before we go into questions. And I know this is somewhat limited to Teslas, but I did want to ask Kurt, you and Paul, if there were any software components to your vehicles that even if firmware is getting modified or changed, is there a process for that, or does that just what you get with the car is what you have today?
Yeah, on the Prius that we've owned, when we were taking it into the dealers for even oil changes and stuff, and they would always check and tell you, oh, there's an update. But it's never been any big change like it probably could be in a Tesla. It wasn't like all of a sudden, the feel or drive or anything of the car. It was kind of invisible stuff that they would fix or update. So there hasn't been a lot of that as much as I think it sounds like on the Tesla. So.
Yeah, the Chevy Volt, keep in mind timing when the Chevy Volt came out was about when the first Tesla Roadster was being made. The Chevy Volt was built to compete with the Prius and then exceed it. So you get better performance when you have that battery packed acceleration. And then the Chevy Volt has now been discontinued because it can't compete with what Tesla's ultimately became. So it was very much built as a classic car against the Prius. And then it failed from the market against the Tesla. And then obviously Chevy moved on to a Bolt to compete with the Tesla.
Right.
But yeah, it's much more just what you get is what you get.
And I think that was one of the biggest surprises, even though I knew about it going into getting a Tesla, was it feels more like this because it changed. Like imagine if you went and bought a smartphone that was supposed to last you like 5 or 10 years. Right? For one, imagine them lasting that long, but also imagine having the same software on it 10 years down the track versus what we get kind of traditionally in this user experience, which is every few weeks, like you're getting a software update and it changes something, even if it's minor stuff, but it's changing something about the device it's running on. And that was very interesting with the Teslas is, I mean, as they continue to roll out more and more of autopilot, seeing that change, but also little things like adding Netflix and Hulu and some of those streaming services into your car. So while you're parked, you can watch that while you're charging your
I think
car.
the most exciting one was the one we got in September where they added 10 miles of range
Yeah,
to the car
yeah,
because they were able to do software improvements to the battery and the electric motors.
yeah. That was very interesting. Yeah, adding more range just with a software update. So.
Are these updates like a Windows 10 update?
They are updates that they say your car has a software update available. Would you like to update it now? You don't have to, but it does ask you, would you like to update it now? Your car will basically be inoperable for 25 minutes. And then it downloads the update and installs it. And it gives you a 2-minute warning after you press OK. Like it says, OK, in 2 minutes, we'll start this update. So if you freak out and you have to cancel it.
So that internet access that I assume it uses to do that is just built into all the Teslas.
Every Tesla has got an LTE modem in it, so it's always connected. But usually the software updates, they want you to download on Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
So you do it in your garage.
Yeah.
So that's probably something else you need to add is get your access point closer to your garage so that the Tesla can communicate to the internet.
I'm curious to ask, are you guys both perfectly comfortable with the not having dealers nearby and Tesla as a company, you feel like?
I think from the right to repair side of things, I would like more tools available even to repair shops so that there could be more of a free market repair shop opportunity. But I've been perfectly happy with the mobile ranger service. They have a van down here every Wednesday, I think it is, in this area, because there's a significant number of Tesla owners here in this area now. So they're just here if somebody needs it, and then they just show up to your house and you schedule the appointment right through the app and get it done.
I'm okay with it simply because our cars are fairly new, but ask me in 5 years if I needed something for that. And really, Kansas needs to change the laws to allow direct sales of cars as well as service of the cars.
Yeah, I was surprised that you couldn't direct sell a car to a person. Like there's no direct to customer in Kansas. You have to have a middleman. And I was like, really? That's weird.
Dealership lobbying.
Dealership lobbying.
So Jason, I've got a couple questions here.
Awesome.
Dave has a couple questions. Excellent comment by Paul on the heater effectiveness of his car. What is that like for being it's like for a Tesla being all electric?
Great question.
Well, one of the things that we have different, although 75% of the parts between our Teslas are pretty common, is the Model Y that I drive has a heat pump now. So it makes it more efficient as far as heating or cooling the car for that. I think you've got a resistant heater, so that kind of chews into your mileage a little bit.
Yeah, I haven't noticed a significant mileage impact while driving in the cold. I drove it all last winter. And I know there was a guy in Norway, I think, who did a YouTube video about camping in his Tesla at -20 outside. And he turned on just turned on the ambient heat. And so just ran at 60 degrees Fahrenheit all night long. And I think he drained 15-20% of his battery on an overnight.
There's a mode in the Tesla called camp mode, where you just put it in camp mode and it maintains the temperature. It also has dog modes. If you want to leave your dogs in the car, just keeps them at 72 degrees and puts a thing on the screen that says, I'm okay, my owner's 72 degrees, we're fine, I'll break the window.
Yeah, there's these little interesting updates and things that they add into there. It's probably some engineering team. It's like, hey, this would be cool. Can we add this? Yeah, just put it on the next update. Like, ship it. But,
so Dave keeps asking questions, but maybe we should take some.
Yeah, let's all. Are there any questions?
Dave and,
Any questions in here before we take another one from Dave?
Tell us about the driving. It's different. Press the pedal, so you get like a little paradigm shift.
Yeah. So the question is, how is the driving different when you're driving a Tesla or even a car with regenerative braking? How does that affect your driving?
Well, in the Model Y, I've got the all-wheel drive one, and it's just instant torque. It's 0 to 60 in 4.5 seconds. I used to fly F-16, so I call it my land-based F-16 because it's so much fun. The first time my wife drove it, she had it 105 miles an hour in the first 10 seconds, and I'm like, okay, I think you for it. So,
but even the braking is different. Like when you let off the accelerator, it starts regenerating.
It's very aggressive regenerative braking, so which is the most efficient. Puts it back in there. Now, one thing in the winter for driving, when the battery pack's cold, it doesn't like getting a lot of electricity shoved into it, so they limit the regenerative braking. And a little notice comes up there, it says your regen braking may be limited, and there's a little indicator, so you may get half of your regenerative braking for that. But I just basically drive with the accelerator, so I rarely touch the brakes.
Yeah, the same thing.
The Chevy Volt actually has an option where you can do the regenerative braking like that, or you just step on the brake and it starts regenerative braking. I typically drive like the normal car just because I'm used to stepping on the brake, but ideally you don't brake heavily, right? To get the benefit. So if you're a stop and go driver, you're going to reduce how much regenerative braking benefit you. And obviously, one of the key elements of regenerative braking is your brake pad should never wear out. So that's the other dream there, is you have less maintenance for those kinds of tasks.
Right.
And on the Prius, I mentioned some of the craziness people do, but you quickly learn they have a screen that tells you how much energy you recovered from regenerative braking. And I think you get little turtles on the screen, and so you're trying to get more turtles. But you find, in the same way it sounds like the other cars, when you do let off the gas, it will engage the regenerative braking, which is good in some sense, but in a lot of cases you get better gas mileage if you sort of feather the gas pedal until you find that range where it's not running the engine and it's not regenerative braking, you're basically coasting, but you have to sort of manage the gas pedal to do that. So while you're, trailing the semi truck trying to draft the thing there, you're feathering the gas pedal and crazy stuff like that. But I think, like Paul mentioned, it feels like to me there's been a real change from when certainly our Prius come out, or maybe even Paul's, where electric cars really hadn't caught on. And so the model was more, we want to take people out of gas cars and make it feel like it's really no different experience. Where now with the Tesla, that's become a sexy thing. And I think people are more willing to like explore and embrace the upside of the electric car. And so I think they're taking a more aggressive stance on trying to do all kinds of cool stuff, where at least in the Prius that I had, it was much more, let's make it as painless and like a normal car as possible.
All right. Do we have another question from online?
Yes, Dave says, our lives change so much every decade. Just think about smartphones. But the question is, are we looking at a time in 10 to 20 years where a new straight combustion engine car will not be allowed to be sold?
In fact, yes.
Yeah.
In Europe, they've already started that process. And California too, I believe.
California says no more ICE cars sold by 2035, I believe. And Britain announced this week that they're not going to sell any more ICE cars after 2030. So.
Yeah, so no more brand new internal combustion engine cars on the road by 2030, 10 years from now.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
A lot of batteries are going to have to be made in the next 10 years.
That's right. So if you're in the industry of mining nickel, go
Lithium.
mine more nickels. Because that's a huge component. Number one demand I know that Tesla has right now is, Elon tweeted about it, just saying like, please go mine more nickel and tell me, and I will buy from you. So, other questions here in the audience? Anything else? I know that we had a few things. Yeah, up here.
So the aircraft industry has the FAA for software. Is there any sort of equivalent for the car industry?
From a software standpoint? Yeah. In terms of managing safety or?
Safety, right. The auto driving, things like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. This idea about safety and who is monitoring or driving the laws or regulations around autonomous driving, but also cars that are mostly software enabled even. And right now that is where you're seeing the government and law just really keep it slow pace and industry just take off regardless. I mean, Tesla doesn't have any regulatory body that I'm aware of that directly restricts its ability to update its software internally. Now there are restrictions around a human still having to be a driver in the car. And this is where they finagle that fine line of, yes, it's autopilot, but you have to be able to take control at any moment. So if you're sleeping in your car, for example, while your car is driving down the road, in a Tesla, the way that works is every 30 seconds, every minute or so, depending on what type of road you're on, the dash or the screen will start blinking blue around your speedometer, and it'll say, please, touch the wheel to let us know that you're still there, basically. And you have to apply a little bit of torque on the steering wheel to stop it from exiting autopilot mode and just everything blinking red and warning you, like autopilot is disengaging. You're no longer able to drive on autopilot for the rest of this trip. Like they'll lock you out of autopilot if you don't, correct that until you put the car in park and then you start driving again.
One of the things when you first set up full self-driving in the car, you have to enable it. And it's like, this is beta mode. I wouldn't say buyer beware, but you need to be alert. And as Lee said, every 20 seconds or so, it's nagging you if you're not touching the wheel or touching something on the wheel for that. As a former military pilot, it reminds me a lot when I drove out to Colorado in September, is you're managing the systems. You're aware, you're watching it do its thing. And I've had enough glitches in the autonomous driving so that you really do need to be aware. Sometimes you'll have a phantom braking if you go under a bridge and there's a shadow. And sometimes, it's going to center that lane, but the person in the lane next to you sometimes can get a little closer than you're comfortable with. So you really have to pay attention. It's not quite there yet.
Especially curves, right?
Yes.
So if you think about going curves, like we as humans kind of hug the outside of the curve. So if you're on the inside track, that person's hugging the outside of their curve, so that's closer to the left lane. And if your car is centered in that lane because of autopilot, it feels like the person next to you is just gonna slam right into you. And so like there's moments where I've taken over and just been like, okay, I don't trust this.
Yeah, one of the other things with autonomous driving is you don't realize how poorly marked all our roads are. Because these automatic systems are looking at the markings, and you're like, oh, a human being, we figure, it doesn't have markings, but I can still drive down it. But
Yeah, it's all vision based on Tesla.
yeah, there's 8 cameras. There's 3 behind the looking forward, 2 to the side, 2 to the back side, and 1 in the back. So it's 360 coverage. And then there's 12 acoustic sensors, and then a radar in the front bumper for low visibility type stuff.
Interesting. What were you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to go back more to the question about regulation. Now, do keep in mind with autonomous driving, they have created categories. So it's like level 2 through 5. 5 is totally autonomous driving. 4 is you can autonomous drive, but you're restricted to an area. And then, 2 is kind of like staying in between the lanes. So they have these, and then state governments are taking different approaches. Nevada, for instance, made it very easy to have autonomous driving. And so Google's effort, Wamigo, actually is doing all their testing in Phoenix. And so they actually have driverless cars in Phoenix being ran like Uber, where there is no human driver in front of the car. But you're going to see that legislation, come out over the next years, and there's going to be all sorts of court cases and all sorts of fun things that come. And I'm sure we'll see a government agency, fill the void as bad things happen in autonomous driving.
And the really interesting component about that is you start down this rabbit hole of we all like to blame somebody else, right? So like, oh, it's not my fault, so it must be my car's fault. Well, if it's my car's fault, is it, the engineer who wrote this piece of software, or is it Tesla, the company, or is it, like where does that stop? And I think it's really interesting that Tesla is getting into the insurance business for their own vehicles, because they have all of the data, they've got all the cameras, they know when you're touching the wheel, when you're not touching the wheel, so they can actually provide super low cost insurance, but also the most accurate insurance to the individual driver who is in that vehicle. And so there's a lot of interesting components about just the automotive ownership model when you have all of these sensors, all of these cameras, all of this awareness about a vehicle at any moment in time.
And I think all the auto manufacturers are going down this autonomous driving thing over the next 10 years. So it's not just Tesla that'll be doing that. So I could see a thing where your insurance company's like, your premium, if you don't drive on autonomous, is going to be high. If you leave it in autonomous mode, then you're going to pay a much less premium, because the systems are more reliable and accurate, or will be, than human beings, because human beings are terrible drivers. One of the things in the Tesla I've had to take over a couple times is because as a human, I can see somebody's not paying attention, or they're not stopping at the whatever, and I have to steer that out. I don't trust the computer to do that quite yet.
Super technology. I drove one back from Michigan Monday. It drove itself.
Mhm.
Just
And then, and so you're saying 5 to 10 years, but they're not gonna have the highways fixed by then.
Yeah, that's,
Because the lines, or the table with line, or they don't repaint it, so it's kicking out. That's going down there. But their technology is awesome. And then I was driving on the way up in Michigan, I drove a 3-year-old Ford pickup. It was right there with all the cameras, all there, it just didn't have the button to auto steer.
Yeah.
Subaru does.
Yeah.
And so it's cool to me, like Tesla as a company, they just pave their own way because they can, right? But then the other companies are benefiting from
Well,
keep up.
and I think this is from a technology software standpoint, the most interesting thing about Tesla is it's not so much a car company as much as it is a battery manufacturing company, but even on top of that, an AI company at the end of the day. I mean, they're the ones with the most mileage driven on any kind of somewhat autonomous system. And so training the awareness of all of the edge cases, right? So if you've got, several billion miles of car time driven on autonomous driving, you've seen a lot more edge cases than any other company. And so being able to license that out or even give access to that type of technology to the other auto manufacturers is why being first in that market is so powerful. Now, doesn't mean that Tesla will always be around. There's been plenty of first to market movers that have been disrupted over the years. But I think it gives them a solid footing to have different verticals of value within their company.
I think it's going to be, several people mentioned the different levels, and I think it is going to be interesting to see the transition, because I think initially everyone thought there's going to be a point when all cars are fully autonomous, and I think that's a very high bar to reach. There's just so many corner cases. The case where you could have nobody behind the wheel is, I think, a long ways off. But even today, there's a ton of cars that have lane keeping abilities and help assistance in parking, and that's some of the same core components. And I'll take this opportunity to mention the Open Pilots is the one thing I'm a little bit familiar with, which is an open source software effort. I think you have to buy a $1,000 piece of hardware, but it builds on top of the components that are already in a car for watching lane changing capabilities. I think it's basically a radar capability that's in Toyotas, and over the last 5 years, Toyotas and Hondas and a surprising number of cars. And there's a unit you put on your dash or on your window, and then it plugs into the OBDC or whatever that port is. But all it can do is keep you in a lane. So if you're on the interstate, you're driving 1,000 miles and you just want help, staying in your lane and distancing you from the cars in front of you, that's what it does. And for $1,000, you can add that to an existing car and open source software. So there's some DIY efforts going on in that, and it'll be interesting to see to what extent that kind of grows up, and that's more the focus as opposed to the fully autonomous car, which is more interesting, but a much harder nut to crack.
Right.
I think about it though, you all drove here today with 2 eyeballs. So if you have at least 2 cameras on the car and you can use stereoscopic vision in some software, it is a solvable problem. Probably the biggest difference between Tesla and some of the other ones like Waymo is using a LiDAR. I know Waymo is very successful in Phoenix, but they also incorporate, I think it's $100,000 for their LiDAR set. And of course, that'll come down over the next few years. But Tesla said, nope, we're all going to be vision and using the radar. I think Mobileye, another company out of Israel that uses only vision for theirs, and they're licensed their technologies to manufacturers in Europe for that. So that's kind of the bifurcation. You got the pro, got to have LiDAR, and then you got nope, we're just going to go with cameras only approach.
I mean, I'm not a Tesla owner, so I can say that there's a certain CEO that maybe overpromises sometimes. And so I do think, you pronounced it correctly, but what is it now? Waymo? Waymo. Okay, I said it wrong. They do have actual driverless cars with no drivers in Phoenix, right? They do have more technology to do that. But it's going to be interesting because Tesla is developing, like their business model is selling cars and batteries, right? And so having everyone still own a car is kind of important to them. That's what's making them successful, is these people that really love Tesla cars, which they're amazing, right? But the question is, will that crumble when we see things like the people no longer owning cars and they just have a taxi service that drives up? There's a lot of different ways this could work out. And, you know, the person that actually has a full level 5 autonomous driving car that works reliably first is going to have an edge. So it'll be interesting to see who wins that battle and how it plays out.
Plus, to your point, think about it too. You go to work and then you let your car go, basically do an Uber all day long and earn you money while you're at work. And
Or you don't even own
me
the
up at
car, you
5.
just pay for it, right? There's something like 2.2 parking spots for every car in America, right? If we no longer had a car, we could all be using our garages to store more junk.
There's a question.
So as an observation, I'm curious if you guys have thought about it and what reaction you might have to it. But when we're driving ourselves, we will instinctively do what we feel is best for us, even without thinking about it. So if you're in an emergency situation, you would run over a pedestrian before you would hit a light pole without thinking about it. When it's software driving the car and it's analyzing the situation, it can make decisions based on different factors, and your car might quit doing what's best for you and start doing what's best overall. And this is a minefield for legislation. Yeah. I'm curious what you guys think about it, and if your car doesn't do what's best for you.
Well, and I think for me personally, this is where it comes into, one, transparency around the autopilot algorithms in particular. So if it's going down the road and it has people in the car versus like the semi use case, which theoretically could get to a point where it's just a big old truck on the road with nobody inside of it. It's filled with oranges coming from California. So if that flips into the ditch to save a van full of people, that's okay. Like, it's just money at the end of the day. But when you're dealing with the human component inside that vehicle, again, like, what is the programming for it? What does the algorithm choose? Is it protect owner, like protect vehicle and occupants first, or over pedestrians, over another vehicular crash? Like, you know, what is the decision that gets made? And I think that there's a level of transparency that I would like to have and see as an owner, to say, at least I should know what it's going to do, like in general. Because you get into the vehicle with any other human being, and again, like human nature does say, like, well, if I'm aware enough, I'm trying to not hit that person and maybe hit an inanimate object instead, or at least, you know, try and avoid all three things, and like maybe I can swerve around and dodge it. But yeah, I think transparency around that would be very important, and then also knowing what happens in what scenario, right? The legislation component. Is it on my insurance? Is it me personally? Is it somebody else? Like, what happens then? And I think that is the biggest risk for early adopters, is we don't know what that will look like yet.
It's also interesting on the philosophy of the whole thing, in that if you look at airplanes, commercial airplane flight is one of the safest modes of transportation going. And even if a plane of 300 people happens to crash every now and then, number of deaths you're still way safer, but yet people will not fly because of that fear. And it's a control thing, I think. It's like, and with cars, you know, we kill, I don't know how many.
25,000 per year.
Right, a ton of people a year, but it's like, yeah, but I'm in control, so it's, you know, you don't worry about it. But once you go to autonomous cars, it's like the airplane thing. I've now given up control, and now if people are dying, there may be 10% as many people, or, you know, way fewer people dying on autonomous cars, but we may care more about it because we don't have control over when that's going to happen. And the other thing I think connected to this is, one of the things on the horizon is not just the cars driving themselves, but the cars talking to each other. Because once the cars start talking to each other, you can cruise at 80 miles an hour, you know, a foot apart, and they'll, you know, manage that. And so roadways and stuff can be used much more efficiently, but the whole dynamics of accidents and things change radically when you're doing that kind of thing. So I think it'll be interesting to see how people give up that sense of control and how that changes their perspective on accidents.
I think somebody asked, it was Elon at Tesla or maybe one of their engineers, is what is the primary directive on this software? This is number one, don't hit anybody or allow yourself to be hit. So that's the overriding focus of the software, is to stop well short of that. But I don't think it's making decisions on, oh, let me take out the old person versus the young person, because I mean, they're not, algorithms aren't making those decisions. They're like, don't hit anything, don't allow yourself to be hit.
I mean, I want to echo what Kurt said. Like, we have shows on Netflix where you can watch tow trucks go out there. Like, it's that common that we have terrible accidents, right? I think once autonomous driving comes over, it'll be much more like, we're going to send an investigating team out to figure out what happened to this one accident because the autonomous car screwed up, right? So I do think as the death toll will decrease drastically. I mean, 1% or less, but we will then be asking these questions much more. You know, right now it's like, if we had autonomous cars, you know, at even some basic level, they'd be better than humans, especially drunk humans, tired humans, texting humans. So initially, to me, from a realistic standpoint, it doesn't matter. But I think as it eventually takes over, it will become much more focused on when it does screw up, why did it screw up?
Oh, Randy, how long has aviation been 90% autonomous?
For a long time,
Yeah,
as far as autopilots go. The big part is the takeoff and landing.
Right.
Because that's when you're closer to doing that. And then, of course, TCAS to keep from hitting other airplanes. It's always the human element, because they think they're smarter. And plus there's a control part of there. And it's like, no, let the computers protect you for that. That's hard for human beings to give up that control.
Go ahead, Kurt.
I have a pilot and have a small plane, and one of the interesting things, we have autopilot. I always thought it was backwards. You take off easily manually, and then you kick on the autopilot. It can fly a path even in a small plane and get you there, and some can even do all the final 10 feet of landing. But if things go bad, like the absolute worst time, the autopilot can kick off and say, I'm out of here, you're playing. And that always seemed backwards. It seemed like, and so the human, you're there for 4 hours, just, falling asleep, desperately trying to stay awake just in case the autopilot kicks off. It seemed like it should be the other way around, where the pilot does the basic flying and the autopilot kind of looks over your shoulder and looks for the worst possible time and says, hey, you're getting off course here, and basically assists the pilot, but they keep the pilot in the loop. Because once you're the pilot, you take them mostly out of the loop, then they just want to doze off or read a book, and it creates these dangerous situations where crazy things happen and you hit, people pushing a bike across a road, and the person was supposed to be watching, but they weren't because they thought that
one of the interesting features on the Tesla is, even when you're not in autopilot, it's still looking out and protecting you. Because I've had it beep at me if I drift to the side of the road, or if I get too close to something, it'll even come up and say, stop. Like you were trying to park in the garage and getting too close, and one of those things. So it's kind of cool to have somebody else looking out for you.
Yeah. Other questions in the crowd or online?
I think some of that safety issue is like for comparing cars to airplanes. What's the worst that happens in your car if the motor blows up? Like stop, right? Airplane, motor, you're comparing apples to oranges on autopilot, and then technology is there's so much less traffic in the air, and they rely on satellites, and they've been doing it for a long time, right?
Right.
And then other. We were talking about something else before that, where it's just a whole different technology comparison on how that can be. Oh, and like the performance. Okay, so your Volt is outdated. It's not because domestic companies quit. They follow the trend, and so now there's a dozen probably models of hybrid SUVs. So they didn't quit the market, but they followed the trend that cars are not the American dream, right? SUVs and trucks. So there's hybrid pickups, there's hybrid SUVs. They're still putting money into it. they still want to help and make a difference.
And some people maybe rightfully argue that, overall we'll save more gasoline by taking the 18 mile per gallon vehicles and getting them up to 30 miles per gallon, like an SUV or a truck, as opposed to taking the person who had the car that was getting 35 and wants to get to 45. And I think there's a lot of logic to that. So I have a question about the Teslas. One of the cool things they do is that, I don't know what you do. You go out and you hit the button and the car comes to where picks you up autonomously. And
I've used that twice.
It's a party trick.
And once was in a parking lot with no cars.
Well, I was going to make a question. I'm sure that somebody set up mazes of cars in parking lots to see if it could find its way.
That too, right? That was in their last Christmas commercial. Beautiful.
Yeah.
The problem is it's slow.
It is so
it's
slow.
It's so slow to do that because it's, making sure it doesn't run anything. So nobody really uses it, I don't think. Except in a rainstorm, people will use it because they don't want to get soaking wet.
That's true.
There's an interesting YouTube channel. In sort of preparing for this talk, I was looking around, and a guy who I think goes out and tries to find challenges for Teslas
Mhm.
and the autonomous mode. And the one that came up first was he tried to drive it down Lombard Street in San Francisco, which very steep and windy. And it's interesting because the car watching it seems to like, okay, I got this, and speeds up really fast, and then it gets to a curve, and the guy's like, gonna grab, and then it stops, and then it goes very slow. So then these cars are all lined up behind it, like, come on, let's get it. But it was interesting to see how it negotiated all those curves. And anyway, if you're looking for challenges for Teslas, there's some cool videos on YouTube.
Yeah.
Do they learn? I mean, does it do the second time down Lombard Street better?
Not on your car.
Not on your car.
Not on your car. Like the idea of the way that I understand it is it's recording all of this data. And then as they release new builds of their full self-driving architecture, like that is released in the new build. So like the newest one that's kind of in beta in 9 or 10 states now, they're slowly rolling it out across the year. Like even when you're a Tesla owner, you can opt to be an early beta user. And then you get all the software updates first. But they're slowly rolling out what they call, interactiveless driving. It was something that was just short of full autopilot. So
Yeah, the big difference between what we have today and our full self-driving and what these early beta testers are is it allowed them to make left and right turns at stoplights and traffic lights. Right now, it doesn't automatically make those turns. I have to do that, but it will stop for stop signs and traffic lights. So in this new beta that's supposed to be out next month, it should make those turns. And if you look at any of those videos, it'll do roundabouts and try to pick that out. But, I still find even in our full self-driving, and even driving down here, I was in full self-driving, and a car was trying to merge onto 35 and it wasn't allowing the room. And so I had to just take over and kind of slow down, let this car get on or else it would have missed my exit. So those are some of the little nuances that I don't think it's quite figured out yet. Plus it drives like grandma.
So you get the gains from the updates, basically.
So are you guys ever worried, just quickly, are you guys ever worried about, the equivalent of the computer like Apple says, we're not going to release new operating systems for Apple computers that are over 6 years old. And are you worried about sort of long-term support on the Tesla?
Well, I think it's more of a hardware thing, right? Like it was the upgrade from like version 2 to version 3 hardware where they said, if you want full self-driving, you have to be on version 3 hardware. And for some, you can upgrade it, for some you can't. So like the super early Model S's, like I think 2014 models even, like they have to be upgraded with hardware before they could run full self-driving. So the computer needs upgraded now. They've said with anything, it was late 2015 beyond was when they started in the factory putting version 3 hardware on. So the cameras and the sensors and the computer. They said that would be full self-driving compatible. all the way through.
Yeah, in fact, they retrofitted some of the 2015 and 16 Teslas with a new computer at no charge, so they can run the latest software. So they make their own silicon now. Tesla does. They used to buy chips from NVIDIA, but the amount of watts that it generated was too much for the car, so they just did their own custom silicon for it. It does 35 trillion operations a second.
Okay, so a question for you on some of this, and you touched on a little bit. 10 years ago, I had an engineering intern that tapped into the computer on his Toyota SUV and tied in some video cameras on the front bumper and tied it into the GPS. So it would self-drive down the road, and it would speed up and slow down as the speed limit changed. His big challenge, though, of course, was construction zones, because the car didn't know that the speed limit was changed. Does Tesla monitor that at all, or is that still something that you have to take over for those areas?
Again, coming back to the idea that if it's all vision-based with cameras, it doesn't matter what the maps say or what's happening. It adapts to the situation right in front of it. So like my commute is down 135 up by Newton, and there's construction there, and it drives through that construction by itself every day.
That is a slowdown.
It reads the cones.
It slows down to adjust for the 60 mile an hour drop speed limit.
So
it reads
there's no traffic. Like, I go through that area too, but I go through it 4 o'clock in the morning, so we're gonna be there.
Right, yes. It reads the sign, sees that it's changed
Okay.
to 60, drops down to 60. So I see my max speed, drops down to 60.
Oh, excellent.
So it reads the speed signs to know.
Yeah, that was released 2 releases ago.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah. So it'll dynamically read those things, because they added cones this year. They added.
It's kind of cool because it'll follow the cones. If your lane plays out, it'll follow the cones into the correct lane.
Come right back up. So the concrete barriers, I'm a little bit more cautious about, but the cones are.
I let it self-drive, but I have my hands on them.
I mean, there is a philosophical difference, right? So Elon Musk was giving Waymo grief on Twitter because Waymo in Phoenix uses Google Maps, like very high resolution Google Maps, to enable their system to drive at that level 4 that they do. And so Elon Musk is claiming that yes, vision will be better, but those aren't yet full self-driving. Waymo is able to do that. So there are 2 approaches. One of them is backing using maps, having this really detailed data to know where stuff is, and looking. Tesla's claiming they don't need that, but we'll see who wins, I guess.
It's not settled.
Right, it's not settled.
It's not settled.
Okay.
It's a big debate. LiDAR, no LiDAR.
We'll know in the next 4 or 5 years.
So I've got a question online. Can Randy or Jason talk to the amazing concept that a Tesla with software updates every 2 to 3 weeks with new features or improved features, they can increase in value over time?
This is a big, interesting debate, because when you look at Tesla's retaining their overall value, now to be fair, like if you're comparing it apples to apples, like Teslas are still a luxury branded car. Like that's the brand they've set out for themselves. So you can compare it to a Camry, sure, but you'd probably be better comparing it to a Lexus, because that's the type of demographic that they're after. Now, as they go down in price, so comparing the S, probably more to a luxury car, maybe a 3 should be compared more to a Camry. But the idea is that over time, 2 things happen, right? Autopilot gets more valuable. When I purchased Autopilot, it was $5,000.
I paid $7,000 and today it's $10,000.
Yeah. So now Autopilot is twice as valuable as it was when I bought my car. Autopilot stays in my car. So if I sell it to somebody today, I've already had an increase in $5,000 in Autopilot. So whether that carries through completely to somebody who's buying a used Tesla at that point, or if it's even kind of a discounted rate, like, okay, well, I'll add $4,000 to the price because he's got Autopilot on, whatever. But there's interesting dynamics there from a stance of the retained value over time is actually improved because you update the ability of the vehicle, right? You can increase its range, you can add new features, you can make it more self-driving. It could become a robot taxi at some point. So if there's a point in which that car now can earn money and becomes an asset on your balance sheet, all of a sudden, what do we do then? Can that be sold as a $40,000, $50,000 car Or if it can generate $40,000 a year worth of revenue from autonomous taxi rides, should it be a $200,000 car as a Model 3? I don't know. We'll see.
So those are great theories, but in practice, I think the free market is going to self-correct this soon. Tesla is a disrupting force. They have this huge stock price that some people don't understand. There's a lot of automakers out there working on the same problems. Tesla's in the lead for sure, right? But I think as things change, as batteries price drops and becomes much more common, other car manufacturers are going to follow, and then I think Tesla's edge is going to become less important. Cars fundamentally deteriorate over time just because of the rough environments that they're in. So it'll be interesting to see, but I think that 10 years from now, the discussion will be different because there'll be a lot more competition in the field.
Yeah, and it's a great point. It's like, what window of time are you looking at? Is it your 5-year resale value, or are you looking at a 20-year like lifespan? And then like, how do you take another 20 years on top of that to have an old car, an antique car? So yeah, we'll see what happens.
So, go ahead.
Murphy?
So is there functionality with the autopilot in passing on Teslas? So, or do you see that if there's not, that being a possibility?
Yeah, so it will detect when cars are passing you. So like if you are changing lanes, when it's on autopilot, you just turn your blinker on. And then it will check that lane and it'll say, are there any cars coming like fast enough to be in the way of me moving over and doing it? Or can I go ahead and move over? So you still have to, currently, I believe this is changing.
You can have auto lane change.
Yeah.
So it will, if you enable auto lane change, it'll figure out when it needs to change the lane.
Right.
My experience with it drives like grandma, and it doesn't always get out of the left lane when it needs to. So I've enabled mine probably the same, where I command it to do the lane changes, and all you do is just flip the turn signal to be able to do that. But hopefully that'll get better.
Yeah. It's overly cautious for sure.
You mentioned that you bought your autopilot for $5,000 and then it stays with the car. So is that something that Tesla has changed? Because I've read multiple cases where someone bought a used Tesla and the options that were advertised to them that were on the car, once they registered the car, suddenly all those options were gone.
Yeah, it's something that they've kind of gone back and forth on, to be honest. So I know that like supercharging was a big one. It used to be that, I think it used to be that supercharging stayed with the car. So like the unlimited supercharging,
Right.
if you got the older cars, you could have unlimited supercharging and that's stuck with the car. I think now supercharging, you get some miles, or if you refer people to a Tesla, you get 1,000 miles worth of supercharging for free. But yeah, it's a great question. Like, how did these companies, Tesla or anybody else, how do they manage the software component? Should it stay with the car? In theory, yes, because one, it fits that model for resale value. But if the company doesn't get a piece of that resale value, it might make more sense to their bottom line to say, no, it doesn't. And you just have to buy it again. Or you as a new user, even buying a used car, have to buy that upgrade. But then should the autopilot go to my next Tesla is the question. So if I've purchased it once and I go from a Tesla to a Tesla, should I have to buy it again? Can it transfer?
So at what point does all of the software on your Tesla become a monthly or annual subscription, like Microsoft does now?
Well, that's a good point. They've actually talked about, because the take rate of the Tesla purchasers that buy the full self-driving option, I think, is about 30%, because it's expensive. And they've talked about just doing where you rent it by the month to get more people to take that. Or, hey, I'm going on a long trip. I think I'll enable autopilot or full self-driving for this month. For that.
But for guys like you that want autopilot all the time, they make a heck of a lot more money than the $5,000 or $10,000 that you pay if you're paying a monthly subscription for the time you have that car.
That's what we hope, anyways.
And if you guys, maybe you already mentioned this, but if you pay extra for a software feature and then you go to sell the car, does that transfer with the car or stay with you? So does the new person have to pay again, because I thought I heard somebody I was talking to, maybe it's Paul, say that some of those features, like if you sell the car, that person, if they want those features, has to
buy it again, yeah.
Has to buy it
The features
again.
just went
I
away.
think if you're doing a private sale to somebody else, the features stay with it. If you're leasing a Tesla for 3 years and then you turn it in for the lease, then, you know, you get no value back for that. I mean,
That's the way that I understand it too. Obviously, I haven't bought I bought mine from Tesla.
Okay.
So I didn't buy it used. It would be a struggle, I think, if you bought one without autopilot, then had a private sale, and then tried to, then you have to go through and update all the account information. So that's an interesting component I don't know that I've read or heard about is, you know, if I have my whole Tesla account, all my information connected to my car, I've got to then disconnect my car from that account and sell it to you, and you have to add it to your account. And then, you know, what happens there, I don't know. But yeah, it's a good question. I don't know that I have the answer to it.
I don't know it either.
And I apologize, that didn't really have anything to do with the technology.
No, it's a good question because it's, you know, another thing to think about as you look at kind of these innovations and these changes. Not all of them are known or even good.
Right.
I mean, I think that, like I said earlier, the biggest one that I had frustration about was, can I repair my car? The reality is no. Like, I can't go modify the software. I can't go understand what's wrong with it even. I just have to go to my app and schedule a ranger to come out and check it out. So.
I have a question, mostly for the Teslas, but one of the early promises when I long ago was looking at the Prius was that they're predicting that ultimately people with hybrid cars and electric cars would serve as a distributed power source, or at least an emergency power source. So it'd be much more reliable. You can plug your car in to charge it, or you can plug it in to suck energy out. So if a hurricane comes, you lose power, you can run your essentials off the battery because you've got an engine there to charge the batteries and a large battery pack and a great emergency power source. Is there a 110 plug on a plug in my microwave?
Cybertruck has a 210.
Yeah.
Or 240. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's got 240. I mean, so yes, that's not available on their existing vehicles, and the idea like you just plug things in. But the Cybertruck and the semi as well, like they're thinking about that kind of stuff. Realistically, like if I'm powering a house in an outage, the battery pack's probably not big enough for a long. I mean, if you cut down on your normal electric usage for a house and rent it, maybe.
So, no, this is actually the interesting point is those battery packs are big enough. Like they're huge, right?
They
Our
are.
cars take so much energy that you could power your house. The problem is it takes extra electronic components to go from DC back to AC.
Right.
And so they are putting that in most vehicles. Now, there was a different electric car manufacturer, I'm not sure who, but they did include that as an option where you could power, 210s, and Tesla's going to do it.
And presumably you can get a standard 12-volt inverter or something you can plug into your car like any car and get 110 out and run that into your house.
I mean, this is a question for the energy grid as we make this enormous transition. Like, how many billions or trillions of dollars was put into fossil fuel energy grid? And now we're talking about switching to electricity. So now Evergy is kind of becoming very important to transportation as we make this change. How is that model going to work? If we're charging at night at home, then we have more options. We're still owning our cars. But if we go to a totally, ride sharing service in the future, then the cars are driving around all day. And so they have to be charged up very quickly. And that takes a huge amount of power compared to what we normally have. They're talking about 60 amp breakers, but that's over the night. These supercharging stations take
600 amp
enormous
services.
amounts of power. And the electrical grid is this fine balance of keeping everything in sync. At the same time, renewables are being added constantly. In Kansas, it's supposedly 50% come from the wind. So, there is this case of heavy electrical car use causing the grid interesting issues as we go forward.
Yeah,
There
absolutely.
was another question.
Jeff?
Oh, I was just gonna say, I have a Mercury Mariner hybrid, and it has a plug in it, it's only 40 watts, but I mean, it came with that, I don't know why, but I could probably run my refrigerator if the lights go out.
There you go.
or at least you're shaded.
Have you guys put in the wall, the Tesla wall?
Yeah, I've got it.
Okay. Now, did you put in the solar as well, or just the wall?
I already had solar on my house. I installed solar myself in 2016.
Okay.
So I've got 11 kilowatt system on my house.
And that was compatible with the wall?
The middle.
Oh, so a power pack. Sorry, I don't have the Tesla battery pack, the power pack
Oh,
for the wall. I have a car charger. For the
Oh,
wall.
okay.
No, so I'm grid tied on my solar, which means I use my own solar power first
Right.
at the house and then feed back into the grid any surplus and they net meter me back.
And you don't feed anything into your car through the solar?
If I'm charging at home during the day, which is very rare.
Okay.
So, and this is where it's interesting for our personal usage because we live out in the country
Right.
and we're an all electric house. So all of our heat and AC is all
Okay.
electric too. Because we knew that we were going to go solar and do all that when we built it. So having that planned out means, yes, our electric bill is the only bill that we pay, but at the same time, it does mean that from a whole home usage, if I was going to try and use my car as a battery, it would last about 2, maybe 3 days of supplying my home with electricity if it was fully charged. Because we're going through in the winter. We'll go through almost 100 kilowatts in a 24-hour period. We'll really rack it up if we're running heat and keeping it at 75.
But if you recharge it during the day, you'd supplement back with your solar.
Right, yes. So the solar would supplement, it would add back in, but if I'm only generating what's in the winter, it's less. So I think in the winter, I'm generating between 50 and 60 on a sunny day.
Okay.
Whereas in the summer, I'll do north of 75 kilowatt hours.
Okay.
So that deficit, right, that's what I would be pulling off my car if I was trying to
Right.
keep my home running on the grid.
Sure.
So it is really interesting because battery storage, the density isn't quite there yet for me to be comfortable spending the money on the packs. I think with these new Tesla cells, it's probably closer to the right, dollar per kilowatt hour
Okay.
storage. But I personally think it's probably 3-5 years before battery density is at the right price point for me to put in a home battery and try and run more off grid than I am now.
Okay.
The Tesla's newest technology, they're installing it in a roofing company in Manhattan. They make a solar shingle.
Yep.
It's a Tesla solar roof, yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
They're
And
They're expensive though.
those are cool, but they're very expensive. And like, for example, my 11.2 kilowatt setup took me maybe 50 man hours to install myself on our roof. Now, granted, I've got a telehandler from the farm, things like that, so that's not hard. But I paid $18,500 for that, shipped to my house, delivered on pallets, and then I just went up on the roof, drilled all the holes under the rafters, and put all the racks up and installed panels, and then had an electrician do the final connect, so that could be certified by the county. But at the end of the day, that's far cheaper than our roof would have cost $70,000-$80,000 for a solar roof.
The cool thing is that what you're talking about, 10, 20 years down the road, that's how you're going to support the extra grid, the extra draw. If you want to make convert, you're going to use every house because every house needs to be a power plant.
Right.
Because not everybody's going to want a wind turbine in their backyard or a nuke plant. Super efficient, creating electricity, but super scary because 4 years ago, one people left.
Well, and I also think there's a lot of regulatory barriers to that. The reality is I went to war with Westar and Evergy on Twitter for about 1.5 years because they tried to jack my electrical rates up. I was getting charged a $90 fee in July when I produce 600 extra kilowatt hours a month into the grid for them. And on top of my $14.50 meter charge, they were charging me over $90 just to be connected with solar.
Right.
And luckily, I had put my solar system in early enough that after 8 months of every month tweeting on my bill and saying, why am I being charged as a producer? Show me the dollars and cents of why I should support the grid and how I'm not. They wouldn't do it. KCC basically said you got to grandfather all these people in, and they did. I mean, on Evergy's grid, I think when they started that transition, there was only 700 connected homes in the state of Kansas, tens and tens of thousands of customers that they have. Only 700 were connected, and they revamped their entire pricing structure because they know that this is coming, right? Where every home could put solar on top of their roofs, and it would really cut into their margins. So
We probably should. It's getting to be 6 o'clock. We should take final questions.
6 o'clock already. Wow, that went fast.
Exciting topic.
Yeah. Any final questions? I'm sure we'll mingle and chat around after. But any other questions that anyone wants to ask?
And if anybody wants a tour, we can do a quick spin through the building, through the hour.
There you go. All right. Well, that's it, guys. Thank you so much, Paul, Randy, Kurt. Really appreciate it. Love your guys' insight. I'm sure we'll all be best friends as EV buddies now from now on, right? It's the fanatical group. But again, Kurt and Tracy, thank you so much for allowing us to be here in this space and providing events like this. I know this is the last one for this year, but guys, stay tuned for 2021 and all of the new events that will be coming around the corner. There's some very smart brains here that help put those together, and Parker's done an incredible job helping facilitate all of this. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for all the sponsors who help make this happen, and we look forward to seeing you in the new year. Have a safe holiday season and stay safe.
Thanks, Jason.
Thanks.